Good afternoon. Today, I want to think about two artists separated by nearly a century, Hans Arp and Hegyu Yang, and how both, in very different contexts, grapple with the fragility of materials. Contemporary artist Hegyu Yang was born in Seoul, South Korea in 1971 and now lives and works between Berlin and Seoul. Her work moves across installation, sculpture, collage, and craft, always attentive to process and to the labor of making. Yang's practice often reopens dialogues with 20th century modernism as a way to think through unfinished histories. Among these is her ongoing conversation with Sophie Tober Arp, and as I would like to highlight today, Hans Arp. In 2013, Yang presented Family of Equivocations in Strasbourg, which was a two-part exhibition shown at the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art, and at Obet 1928, the original interior of which was designed by Hans Arp, Sophie Tober Arp, and Theo van Doesburg back in the 20s. There, she installed her kinetic wearable sculptures called sonic wares within the restored Cine Dancing Obet room. Sonic wares are dress items made from clusters of bells, and visitors were invited to wear the various ponchos, bracelets, ankle socks, and scarves. Their movements became sound pictures echoing through the former dance room designed by the Arps. This is a video I took with a lovely intern at Kukje Gallery when I was hard working there. Oh, there we go.
Sliders.
So this is one of the sonic wares. I'll just play the video again. No. There we go. Another room in the exhibition was devoted to trustworthies, collage works using cut-up envelopes and graph paper. The work spread out over 3 walls in a diagonal composition, recalling the design of the Obet's Cine Dancing. Yang began the Trustworthies in 2010. It is an ongoing series of collages made from the patterned interiors of security envelopes. The various hues of colored grids are printed inside envelopes to obscure private correspondence. She collects these security envelopes from around the world, tears them by hand, and arranges the fragments into geometric compositions. Each torn piece bears traces of global circulation and secrecy. By tearing the paper rather than cutting it, Yang breaks the printed order of the pattern, the hand interrupting the logic of the machine. The torn edges soften the geometry and reveal the fibrous texture of the paper underneath. The resulting surface, both rhythmic and fragile, becomes a kind of map of communication and concealment. In their quiet irregularity, the Trustworthies resonate with another set of torn papers produced almost a century earlier, Hans Arp's Papier Déchiré. For Arp, the year 1930 marked a crucial shift. He later described it as a moment when he, while preparing older collage works for an exhibition, discovered that time and humidity had devastated them. I quote, "Some of the papers had come unstuck. They were covered with spots, mold, and cracks, and between paper and cardboard blisters had formed that looked more loathsome to me than the bloated bellies of drowned rats." So more mice mentioned in Arp's writing. Initially, he despaired, but he soon began to work with this decomposition instead of against it. My collages began to come undone and show blisters. Thus, I introduced decline and death into my compositions. I reacted by shunning precision from one day to the next. Instead of cutting the paper, I tore it up with my hands. I made use of objects I found on the beach, and I composed natural collages and reliefs. This change was not just technical. Arp's torn papers embody an acceptance of decay. This brought a kind of visceral, almost destructive energy to his process. Up to that point, he had sought technical refinement, but now he began to tolerate and even invite imperfections. You can see this most clearly in his papier déchiré. As Eric Robertson points out, when studied closely, the works are veined with smudges and streaks of glue. Arp would coat the entire support with glue so that he could slide pieces of paper around before fixing them in place. The traces left behind, the glue, the ink marks, and the fibers, record these movements. 1930 thus marked a turning point. From then on, torn edges and smudges of paper became evidence of time and death of the works laid directly in them. And perhaps Arp began to see other material through the lens of change. What I want to consider is how we can imagine this transience in his sculptures, which often exist in multiple mediums. Yawning shell, for example, is a form he produced in several materials: plaster, marble, and bronze. This serial transformation, plaster to marble to bronze, in whichever order, reveals sculpture's translation across materials. Each version carries a different relationship to time. The plaster can crumble, the marble can weather, the bronze can oxidize. Each registers its own form of change. However, the existing plaster yawning shell have met a new addition. After Arp's death, some of his plaster sculptures were coated in shellac, a resin derived from the secretions of the female lac insect on trees. It is unclear by whom and for which exact purpose, but we can suspect that the shellac was applied to stabilize fragile surfaces and prevent crumbling. It is also worth noting that in order for plastic sculptures to be further cast and reproduced, they must be covered first in a sealant such as shellac. But this posthumous application also changed the work's appearance. The matte, chalky plaster became amber-toned, slightly glossy. Light now played across the surface in ways that perhaps Arp did not intend. We can refer to this yawning shell in the collection of the National Museum of Norway in Oslo, which is dated 1981 to 1982, so another posthumous production, to imagine what it would have looked like before the shellac was applied. Shellac, though natural, introduces an artificial permanence. It protects the sculpture by transforming it, sealing it with a hardened film. What was once porous becomes impenetrable. This intervention poses a subtle contradiction. Arp has accepted decay as part of an artwork's life, and even incorporated it into his papers and reliefs. The resin imposes a stillness foreign to that commitment. It renders permanent what was once vulnerable. Yet the gesture also points to a shared impulse across time and geography, the desire to preserve the trace of touch, to keep the artwork alive by giving it a new skin. In Haegu-Yang's work, this gesture becomes active rather than corrective. Her use of lacquer, like shellac, draws on a tree-derived resin, but she turns its properties towards exposure. Her lacquer painting series began in 1990s and are collages of organic and synthetic debris from her studio environment. Scraps of paper, knife blades, and packaging material, all sealed under layers of inexpensive household varnish. Unlike the refined uchi tradition in Korean craft, where tree-driven lacquer is applied in thin polished layers, Yang's method is thick and volatile. The synthetic varnish gives off fumes and takes weeks or months to cure. During that time, she leaves it outside, and dust, rain, and insects land on the surface and become part of it. So when the resin hardens, these incidental traces remain embedded, preserved not by intention, but by accident. The result is a surface that records the environment of its making. Young's lacquer functions as a membrane that captures the atmosphere, the air, and the duration of drying. In contrast to the shellac that hardened Arp's plaster after his death, Young's lacquer documents a living process of interaction with time. Her resin doesn't deny decay, it slows it, translates it, and renders it visible. The insects caught in the surface, the tiny flecks of dust, the ripples left by rain, all speak to a collaboration between matter and moment. Through this process, Young turns a technique of preservation into one of inscription. Her lacquer does not fix a finished image, it gathers the world around it. Seen together, Arp's torn papers, Yawning Shell, and Young's trustworthies and lacquer paintings trace a shared inquiry into how artworks live through change. Arp's papier déchiré emerge from loss and decay, yet they reveal new possibilities for composition. Young's torn envelopes and lacquered panels inherit that understanding of impermanence, but she works within a contemporary field of circulation, of letters, digital networks, and disposable materials. Her tears update art's language for a world in which information weathers and erodes. Both artists remind us that the artwork is not an object of permanence, but a process of becoming. The torn paper, the crumbling plaster, the hardened resin all register the passing of time as a visible condition. Arp's acceptance of decay and Young's embrace of exposure lead paradoxically to the same insight. Preservation is never neutral. To protect something is to change it. To let it age is to allow it to live. Their shared use of tree-derived resins and their synthetic counterparts, although through different agencies, captures this duality. In the end, their works ask us to look closely at surfaces, to see not only form, but time itself. And I want to end with this statement. I now welcome the decomposition that sets in as soon as a work is finished. Light fades colors. Sunshine and heat produce blisters, make the paper peel off, cause the paint to crack and crumble. Moisture breeds mildew. The work decomposes and dies. The death of the picture no longer made me despair. In creating the picture, I began to incorporate its disappearance and its death, and included them in the composition. Thank you.
Any remarks or questions?
Thank you for this great presentation and this uncanny historical parallel. And I might have just missed something, but how did Young come to Arp's work? What was the process of discovery here?
Well, she has been based dually between Germany and Korea for quite some time. She went to school there and now teaches in Frankfurt. So the exposure to Dadaists and avant-gardists was a very natural one, and it came pretty early in her career. In terms of the specific works that I talked about, I mean, Young will often cite and reference Sophie Tober Arp more than Hans Arp in her works. But I saw a parallel between specifically her lacquer works and this sort of posthumous use of shellac in Hans Arp's works. And the first exhibition that I introduced, which was the 2013 exhibition in Strasbourg in the Aubette, I thought was a nice moment of kind of collision between the three artists in a space that was designed by the Arps, which then Young activated with sounds and her own sculptures.
Any further questions?
That was a great presentation. Excuse me if I didn't follow everything well enough so that I still have this one question. In terms of the application of the lacquer to the plaster models, was that something that he understood as just part of his process to produce them in other materials, or you said they're posthumously done, but this one seems to be done when he's alive, and so was that part of that process, or?
That's a question that's still lingering in my head too. I thought about this because the works that are made in bronze, for example, is also dated in the same years as this one. So that kind of alludes to the fact that it must have been produced when he was still alive, which means the plaster would have then, if that was the model that it was cast from, would have been sealed with the shellac. But there is also the marble. And I know that marble can be cast as well and then reproduced in bronze. So because there are these three kind of transformation of materials, it's hard to pinpoint which one came first and which one was sort of the posthumous effort. I would argue that all of the shellac was done after the works entered a museum collection. I don't think that was an effort that the artist would have been part of.
Excuse me may I add something to that? The shellac is also a process of the casting itself. And it was that when Arp gave away, for him, the plaster was the material in which he found the form. And the moment it was given into the process into the foundry would cover it with shellac before it went into the whole process of sand-driven how do you call it? Gussgüsse, casts. So this can very well be applied during it. It probably, if that is a lifetime, if this is a lifetime gips, plaster, sorry for this, then it would be a lifetime application of the shellac, but not by him personally, but by the foundry.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I noted that earlier that you need that sealant in order to reproduce it and to cast it. But I think because the marble version exists, then comes the question of which came first, because the marble would have been sculpted by the artist, and if plaster
No. With Arp, it was also that his sculpturing process was within the plaster, and also the marbles he gave away to craftsmen the same way, but they were all done during his lifetime. So he oversaw the process, but he didn't make the marble himself, especially not with the late works here.
Okay.
Yeah, they were made with the pointing system, yeah.
Plasters break and are destroyed. And therefore, with plasters, you have the problem that normally they produce some more copies. The foundries do it on their own to make sure that the form will remain. It's for security's sake. And when we checked the origin of the plasters, there were quite a lot there. We couldn't find exactly the provenance, which we just put aside. Only when we found out the form is there, documented, then we could work on that. It is very hard to find out on the side. Anywhere, it's not only us. I've made it very difficult. This stuff is big.
Right.
We have another question back here.
Wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you have a sense of what brought about this shift in Arp's thinking in the 40s, where he begins to invite the imperfection into his works.
Yes, the shift is 1930. He kind of writes in the 40s, reflecting back to that moment of when he found these old collages that he was preparing for an exhibition, and found that they had, they had torn apart and kind of deconstructed themselves, and decides to embrace them.
Thanks, Josie. It was just a quick question from a conservation point of view. I guess there must be a bit known about the stability of shellac as a material. What is the stability of shellac as a material?
The stability? Well, like most tree-derived resin, it will harden. So it's sort of a liquid form that is applied, and then it hardens into a surface that is not as porous and very glossy and more durable than, for example, plaster would be. And that's why it's applied before it is then kind of cast or reproduced in other ways. So I don't quite know the physical properties or the chemical kind of components of shellac, but it is, to my understanding, very similar to lacquer, which I'm more familiar with, in that it is, liquid in the beginning, and then once you dry it in a certain atmosphere and conditions, so a certain humidity and certain temperature, then it hardens into a hard surface.
Okay, Josie, thank you so much.
Thank you.